Okay, so you know how much we love to like dig into stuff that we know will help you guys like right away.
Totally. And today we're focusing on something I know a lot of people struggle with.
Yeah, speaking English fluently
Yeah, like really fluently.
and doing it in a way that like feels natural and confident.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've got some awesome resources lined up.
Yeah, so there's this great blog post called How to Speak English Fluently, 14 Powerful Tips and Tricks.
Okay.
And we're also drawing on some really insightful discussions from the Master English podcast.
Cool.
Yeah, and what we're trying to do is, really distill that down to the most like actionable
This stuff
strategies.
you can actually use right now.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
you can actually like implement them right away and start seeing results.
I like it.
Yeah. And we're going to kind of go beyond just the basic vocabulary and grammar stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And look at some practical stuff that you can use in real life conversations.
Sounds good. So let's jump right in.
Let's do it.
And I think, right off the bat, the blog post makes it super clear that speaking practice is like the most important thing.
Oh, absolutely. Like that's the foundation.
Yeah, the more you actually speak, the better you get, right?
It sounds obvious, right? But, it's amazing how many people like kind of neglect that part.
Right. They get so caught up in like studying grammar rules and memorizing vocabulary lists.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But like actually speaking is where the magic happens.
Exactly.
And the blog post gives some really cool suggestions for finding opportunities to practice, like even if you don't live in an English-speaking country.
Yeah, like what kind of stuff?
Well, they talk about things like finding language exchange partners.
Okay.
There's tons of websites and apps for that.
Right, right.
And that's a great way to like connect with people from all over the world who are learning English.
Yeah, and you can help each other out.
Exactly. You can practice speaking English with them, and they can practice speaking your native language with you.
Nice.
They also talk about working with an online tutor.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, you can get like personalized feedback and
Oh,
attention,
mm-hmm.
and they can really help you with your specific weaknesses.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and the cool thing about online tutoring is that it's like super accessible now.
Right. You can find tutors from anywhere in the world.
Exactly, and it's often more affordable than traditional in-person tutoring.
True, true.
Um, and then there's also language learning apps, that incorporate speech recognition.
Oh, yeah, those are pretty cool.
Yeah, you can like speak into the app and it'll give you feedback on your pronunciation.
Right. Like tell you if you're making any mistakes.
Exactly. So that can be really helpful.
That's a good way to get like immediate feedback.
Definitely, yeah.
I also like the suggestion of just like narrating your life in English.
Oh, yeah, that's a fun one.
Yeah, just like talking to yourself about what you're doing throughout the day.
Exactly. It might sound weird, but it's actually really effective.
Yeah, it's like a low pressure way to just get comfortable with forming sentences,
Right. And it helps you to think in English.
which is so important for fluency.
Yeah, because if you're always translating in your head, it just slows you down.
Exactly.
One thing the blog post also highlighted was the importance of one-on-one tutoring.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And it even referenced something called Bloom's 2 sigma problem.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic study.
I know, right?
Yeah, basically it showed that students who received one-on-one tutoring performed like significantly better than students who were in traditional classrooms.
It's amazing how much difference that personalized attention can make.
All right. It's like having a coach who can tailor the instruction to your specific needs.
Yeah, exactly.
And the blog post kind of connected that to language learning by saying that, working with a tutor can really accelerate your progress.
Yeah, because you're getting that targeted feedback.
Right. And they can really help you to identify and work on your weaknesses.
So it's like a more efficient way to learn.
Definitely.
All right, so we've talked about speaking practice and the benefits of one-on-one tutoring.
But what about like absorbing the language in other ways?
Oh, yeah, that's huge.
Like through immersion and just like daily exposure to English.
Yeah, the more you surround yourself with the language, the better.
Right. It's like almost like subconscious learning.
Exactly. Like you're just kind of soaking it up.
Yeah. And the blog post outlined some really cool ways to do that.
Yeah, like what kind of stuff?
Well, they suggest things like changing the language settings on your phone and your computer to English.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. It's like a simple change, but it makes a big difference.
It forces you to encounter English on a daily basis.
Right. Even if it's just for like basic tasks.
Exactly.
They also talk about listening to English music.
Oh, yeah, music is great.
It's fun, and it's like a natural way to learn new vocabulary.
And it helps you to get used to the rhythm and intonation of the language.
Right.
They also recommend watching movies and TV shows in English.
That's a good one.
Yeah, even if it's with subtitles at first.
Right, right.
You can gradually challenge yourself to like turn the subtitles off or switch to English subtitle.
Exactly.
Um, and then, of course, reading is also important.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Reading news articles, books, blogs, whatever interests you.
Right. It's all about like getting that exposure to the language.
Absolutely.
Um, and then the blog post also mentions keeping a language journal.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, writing down new words and phrases that you come across.
Exactly. It helps with retention.
And it can be like a fun way to track your progress.
Definitely.
All right, so we've talked about like the importance of immersing yourself in the language. But what about technology?
Oh, yeah. Technology can be a huge help.
Like there are so many language learning apps out there these days.
It's crazy, right?
I know it can be overwhelming.
Totally. But the blog post kind of cautions against relying on apps too much.
Really?
Yeah, it's like they can be a good supplement, but they shouldn't be your main course. It's like they even quote John Fotheringham, who says that language apps are like a supplement to a balanced language learning diet, not the main course itself.
That's a good analogy.
It is, right?
So what's the main course then?
Well, it's really all about like actively engaging with the language
Oh,
and
yeah.
through things like speaking practice and immersion.
Right, so using the apps to kind of reinforce what you're learning elsewhere.
Exactly. Like it can be helpful for things like vocabulary acquisition or grammar practice, but they can't really replicate the dynamic nature of real-world communication.
Nice.
One resource that the blog post really highlights is YouTube.
Oh, yeah, YouTube's awesome.
It is, right? It's like a treasure trove of information.
And it's free.
Exactly. And you can find videos on pretty much any aspect of the English language.
Yeah, like grammar, pronunciation, vocabulary.
You name it.
Yeah.
And the cool thing about YouTube is that you can often watch with subtitles.
Oh, yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah, you can adjust the playback speed to better understand the nuances, and you can replay sections that you might have missed.
Right. It's like having total control over your learning experience.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got tons of resources available to us.
Yeah.
But how do we know where to start?
Well, the blog post makes a really important point about using materials that are appropriate for your skill level.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, you don't want to jump into something that's too advanced and then get discouraged.
Right.
So they kind of break it down into different levels.
Okay, like what?
So for beginners, people who are at like the A1 or A2 level, they recommend things like gamified language learning apps.
Okay.
Those can be fun and engaging.
Yeah.
Children's books with simple vocabulary.
Right.
Basic conversation guides,
Okay.
just to kind of build a solid foundation.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and then for intermediate learners,
Like B1, B2.
Exactly.
What do they suggest?
So for intermediate learners, they recommend gradually challenging yourself with slightly more complex materials.
Okay.
So things like watching news reports with English subtitles,
Okay.
reading simpler novels or articles aimed at like a slightly younger audience.
Right.
Engaging in conversations on familiar topics with native speakers.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And then for advanced learners.
So for advanced learners, it's really all about immersing yourself in authentic materials that native English speakers themselves consume.
Okay.
So things like movies and TV shows without subtitles, a wider range of podcasts on diverse topics,
Cool.
more complex novels,
Okay.
and engaging in like really nuanced discussions with native speakers.
So it's all about like continuously pushing yourself.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got our resources figured out. We're
Yeah.
practicing speaking. We're immersing ourselves in the language. But what else can we do to like really take our fluency to the next level?
Well, the blog post really emphasizes the importance of stepping outside your comfort zone.
Oh, yeah, that's key.
It can be tempting to just stick with what you're comfortable with.
Right, to stay in that safe space.
Exactly. But real progress happens when you challenge yourself.
Yeah, you've got to push those boundaries.
Absolutely.
Like, what are some examples?
Well, they talk about things like switching those subtitles from your native language to English.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
It can be tough at first, but it's incredibly effective.
Yeah, it really forces you to listen more carefully.
Exactly. And it helps you to develop your comprehension skills.
Mm-hmm.
They also talk about engaging in conversations with native speakers.
Oh, yeah, that's a great way to challenge yourself.
It is, right? Because you have to think on your feet and respond in real time.
Exactly.
Right.
There's no pausing the conversation to look up a word.
Right.
You just got to go with it.
Exactly. And that's where the fluency really develops.
I see.
And speaking of which, they also touch on the importance of pronunciation.
Oh, yeah. Pronunciation's huge.
It is right, because if people can't understand you, then you're not really communicating effectively.
Yeah.
And they kind of emphasize that it's not necessarily about completely losing your accent,
Right.
because your accent is part of your identity.
Exactly.
But it's about making sure that your English is clear enough for others to understand.
Yeah, like you don't want to be misunderstood because of your pronunciation.
Exactly.
And they even talk about the physical aspect of
Yeah,
pronunciation.
yeah, for sure. Like, especially for people whose native languages have very different phonetic systems.
Right.
It might require you to learn new ways to move your mouth and your tongue.
It's like training your muscles.
It is, right?
And they mentioned a really cool tool called Youglish.
Oh, yeah. Youlish is awesome.
I've heard of that. What is it?
So basically, you can type in any sentence and hear it spoken by native speakers in a variety of English accents.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah, it's super helpful for practicing your pronunciation.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've talked about pronunciation.
Yeah.
But what about moving beyond individual words?
Oh, yeah, that's key.
Like thinking in larger units of language.
Yeah, the blog post and the Master English podcast both emphasize this.
Okay.
It's like fluency isn't about meticulously constructing sentences word by word.
Right.
It's about using preformed blocks of language,
Oh, I see.
like phrases or word chunks.
Okay.
And that just makes your speech sound more natural and less hesitant.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and the blog post gives a really simple example.
Like what?
So instead of just memorizing the word tonight,
Yeah.
learn the entire phrase, tonight I am going to.
Okay.
That helps your brain to prepare for a more complete thought.
Right.
And it just sounds more natural.
Yeah, that's a good tip.
And they also talk about a technique called sentence mining.
Sentence mining. What's that?
So it's basically the process of actively identifying and collecting useful and natural sounding sentences
Oh,
that you encounter in your reading and listening. And then you can practice using those sentences in your own conversations.
so it's like building up a repertoire of phrases.
Yeah, exactly.
I like that.
Yeah, and the Master English podcast talks a lot about this too.
Really?
Yeah, it's like they really emphasize the importance of learning and using natural expressions.
Okay.
Because that's what native speakers do.
Right. They don't just speak in individual words.
Exactly.
And this kind of leads us to the topic of idioms.
Oh, yeah. Idioms are fun.
They are. And they can really make your English sound more colorful and natural,
Absolutely.
but they can also be tricky to learn.
They can be, yeah.
The blog post gives some good examples of workplace idioms.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Things like back to the drawing board,
Okay.
cut corners out of the loop,
Yeah.
touch base,
Yeah.
get the ball rolling.
Those are all good ones.
Yeah, and it's like knowing those idioms can really help you to navigate conversations in a professional setting.
Definitely.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. But I think there's one more thing we need to talk about.
What's that?
The fear of making mistakes.
Oh, yeah. That's a big one.
I know it can be really paralyzing.
It can be, but it's important to remember that everyone makes mistakes.
Even native speakers.
Exactly. It's part of the learning process.
Yeah, you're not going to speak perfectly from day one.
Right.
The blog post actually talks about this.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and they mention Ollie Richards' concept of tolerance for ambiguity.
Tolerance for ambiguity. What's that?
So basically, it's about being okay with not understanding everything perfectly
Okay.
and being comfortable with making mistakes.
Right.
It's like you have to embrace the messiness of language learning.
Absolutely.
And the Master English podcast kind of echoes this sentiment.
Yeah.
It's like they really encourage learners to just go for it.
To not be afraid to speak up.
Exactly.
Even if you're not sure if you're saying everything perfectly.
Right, because the more you speak, the more you'll learn.
Absolutely.
And the better you'll get. All right, so for those who are really serious about taking their fluency to the next level,
Yeah.
the blog post talks about some more significant lifestyle adjustments.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, the most obvious one is immersion.
Right. Like moving to an English-speaking country.
Exactly, but that's not always feasible.
No, definitely not.
So they suggest some other things like seeking out a job or a hobby that requires speaking English.
Oh, yeah. That's a good one.
Yeah, like if you can incorporate English into your daily life, it'll just become more natural.
Absolutely.
They also talk about hosting English-speaking travelers.
Oh, yeah. That's a fun one.
Yeah, you can meet people from all over the world and practice your English.
And you can learn about different cultures.
Exactly.
And then they even suggest establishing English-only times within your household.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, like maybe you and your family or roommates agree to only speak English for like an hour each day.
That's a good idea.
Could be fun.
Yeah.
And then they have this funny suggestion. They say you could fall in love with a native English speaker.
Oh, that's a good one.
It's like a little bit tongue-in-cheek,
Yeah.
But it does highlight the power of like personal motivation.
Totally.
If you're really passionate about something, you'll find a way to make it happen.
Exactly.
Another practical tip that they offer is to plan out small conversations beforehand.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, especially for like events or situations where, you'll have the opportunity to practice your English.
Okay.
So it's like if you're going to a party or a meeting, just take some time to think about some potential conversation starters
Right.
or like key vocabulary related to the topic.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it can really help you to feel more prepared and confident.
And to avoid those awkward silences.
Exactly.
One thing that I found really reassuring from the blog post was the advice to not focus too much on perfect grammar,
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
especially in the beginning.
Yeah, it's like native speakers don't even speak perfectly all the time.
Right? They make mistakes, they use slang, they don't always follow the rules.
Exactly.
So it's like the goal should be to communicate effectively,
Absolutely.
not to be grammatically perfect,
And your grammar will naturally improve over time.
as you get more exposure to language.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about grammar,
Yeah.
but what about vocabulary?
Oh, yeah. Vocabulary is essential.
You got to have the words to express yourself.
Right.
The blog post kind of touches on how vocabulary acquisition can happen naturally.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Through like interacting with the language, reading, watching videos.
Right. It's all about exposure.
Absolutely.
But they also mention some specific vocabulary learning techniques. Sort of like what?
Like spaced repetition systems.
Spaced repetition. What's that?
So it's basically a way of reviewing vocabulary at increasing intervals so that you're more likely to remember it.
That makes sense.
Yeah. There are lots of apps and programs that use spaced repetition.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So we've covered a lot of ground today. But I think the Master English podcast really gave us some valuable insights into like what it truly means to speak like a native.
Oh, yeah. That's a great point.
And it goes way beyond just grammar and vocabulary.
Right. It's about like the whole package.
Exactly.
Like your pronunciation, your tone, your cultural understanding.
Yeah, it's about those subtle things that native speakers do without even thinking about it.
Exactly.
And one thing they emphasized was the importance of rhythm and intonation.
Oh, yeah. That's huge.
It's like the music of the language.
Right. It's how your voice rises and falls.
Exactly.
And it conveys so much meaning.
Yeah.
And they recommend a technique called shadowing.
Shadowing. What's that?
So basically, you listen to a native speaker and you try to imitate their rhythm and intonation.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's a really effective way to develop a more natural-sounding voice.
I like that.
Yeah.
Another key point from the podcast was about reducing mental translation.
Oh, yeah, that's so important.
If you're always translating in your head, it's just going to slow you down.
Exactly.
And they suggest practicing inner conversations in English.
Right, it's like talking to yourself in your head.
Exactly.
It sounds weird, but it really works.
Yeah, it's like training your brain to think in English.
Exactly.
And then finally, they talk about filler words.
Oh, yeah, and like
Exactly.
people often think of those as like bad habits.
Right.
But actually, they're a natural part in spoken English.
Really?
Yeah, they help to create a more fluid and conversational flow.
I see.
So the advice is to not be afraid to use them.
But like not too much.
Right, in moderation.
Okay.
And then they also talk about connected speech.
Connected speech, what's that?
So it's how native speakers link words together.
Okay.
So like want to becomes wanna.
Right.
And going to becomes gonna. It's just a more natural way of speaking.
So we should try to do that too.
Definitely. It'll make your English sound more fluent.
All right, so to sum it all up,
Yeah.
the journey to English fluency is a multifaceted one.
It is.
It involves consistent practice across all areas of the language.
Speaking, listening, reading, writing, active engagement with authentic materials,
Pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone
and embracing the learning process.
with all its imperfections.
Exactly.
And it's really more about effective communication
Right.
than perfect grammar.
Absolutely.
So for you, our listener,
Yeah.
we encourage you to pick one or two of these strategies that resonated with you
Mm-hmm.
and start incorporating them into your daily routine today.
Even small, consistent efforts can lead to big results.
Exactly.
So what are you waiting for?
Get out there and start speaking English.
And have fun with it.
That's the most important part.
Absolutely.
All right, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
Until then, keep practicing.
And keep learning.
Bye for now.